Welcome to the How We Can Heal podcast. My name is Lisa Danilchuk, and I'm a psychotherapist specializing in complex trauma treatment. I'm a graduate of UCLA and Harvard University, and I'm thrilled to share these reflections on how we can heal with you today. Today, our guest is Michael Coy. Michael Coy is a licensed clinical social worker, consultant, and trainer based in Bremerton, Washington. Psychodynamically grounded, Michael integrates EMDR therapy with additional training in hypnosis, ego state therapy, and sensory motor psychotherapy. He offers clinical consultation on diagnostic evaluation and clinical practice with persons with complex trauma and dissociative symptoms. Michael is an EMDR certified approved consultant and trainer through the EMDR International Association and served on their standards and training committee. Michael also co-chaired the ISSTD, International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation's EMDR Therapy Training Task Group, which created ISSTD's EMDR Therapy Basic Training. He now co-chairs the EMDR Therapy Training Committee at ISSTD and co-teaches the training. He has also co-authored an article and a book chapter on screening and diagnostic assessment of dissociative disorders. Michael has served on the board of directors of the ISSTD since 2017 and became treasurer in 2018, a role in which he continues to serve. Michael and I connected through our shared board and executive committee service to the ISSTD. I have always appreciated his ability to articulate the nuances of this work with a grounded and clear voice, and I've come to highly regard his opinion and input on clinical as well as systemic matters. He's also kind and quite funny, so I'm grateful he's made the time to share his thoughts with us here today. Let's welcome Michael to the show. Michael Coy, I'm so excited to have you on the How We Can Heal podcast. You have so much wisdom and experience to share, and I'm really looking forward to our listeners getting to know you because I feel like you're one of those gems that I've met within the ISSTD that holds so much, and I want to help.
You are a sweetheart.
Spread it out.
I feel like I'm in very august company. Lisa, you are not a slouch yourself. And the other guests you have had, I feel like my bust is being put into an alcove in a large building.
Yes.
So I appreciate being invited. It's quite an honor.
Yes, you're right there with so many amazing people in terms of, I think, what you've contributed and are contributing to the field. So I really want to honor that and mine some of that in the time we have together today. So we met through the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. We've served on the board and executive for years together now. So I know, some of this insight and brilliance that you carry. And I'm always curious, and we haven't had the opportunity to talk about this before. When did you first learn about dissociation?
Well, infancy.
Oh, there you go.
Actually, I wouldn't say it was explicit learning, but it was infancy. I was actually put in an incubator as a preemie.
Oh, wow.
For an extended period, and I have been told that I almost died.
Wow.
This was the early 1970s, and incubators were not Club Med.
Yeah.
They were these large contraptions, and they had ultraviolet lights, and I had to have patches on my eyes because the final layer of my cornea hadn't developed yet. This is all very technical, but what I've been told. And they had to restrain me.
Wow.
From touching my eyes. So they've got this teeny tiny little thing, and they didn't understand that you need touch back then, and you need eye contact and all these other wonderful things that we get now about babies and newborns. And so I'm pretty certain that that's where I learned about it.
Yeah, I feel it's so interesting. I think some folks listening know I'm about 9 months pregnant now, and I can feel the baby moving as you're talking. Make of it what you will. But yeah, we know now that we need touch and skin to skin and eye contact if it's safe. I don't know with the eye condition you were working with. So then that was your first experience. I'd imagine you found a way back to that experience through your own sort of journey and personal growth. A quick aside, we're touching upon medical trauma here, a related topic we haven't talked much about yet. It may actually surprise you that medical experiences such as surgery, even care in early infancy, can lead to experiences of trauma and dissociation. And sometimes folks come in thinking they're unpacking one memory and it ties back, sometimes through EMDR, ties back to an experience of surgery or dental work or early infancy care. The early infancy stuff is much more challenging. If we had more time, we'd unpack that with Michael here today. Perhaps we'll have him back on the show. But just to fill you in, this is a thing, medical trauma. There's books written about it. If you have questions on this particular topic, please send them to me at podcast@howwecanheal.com. And perhaps we'll have an entire episode about it at some point. All right, back to the show. Did you find learning explicitly about dissociation to be easy or available, or was that a long trek?
I very distinctly remember reading When Rabbit Howls back 29 years ago around this time of year, actually. And that was my first real exposure to anything related to dissociation.
Okay.
It was my mother's copy of the book. I would note my mother and father both had complex trauma histories, and my mother didn't really remember her childhood.
Wow.
So when I kind of, say, well, I learned about dissociation in infancy, I was in the soup probably my entire growing up life. I didn't really choose to study dissociation. I stumbled over it and was faced with it with clients. And after reading When Rabbit Howls in 1994, it was only when I became a therapist and only after I got trained in EMDR in 2011, it hasn't been all that long ago, but it also feels like forever ago, that I kind of was forced to relearn or revisit probably some things that were intuitive and other things that there have been concepts within, understanding about dissociation that have been more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel very comfortable swimming in these waters for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. There's so much in what you just said. I want to unpack what felt intuitive, what didn't feel intuitive, but you also brought up this pairing of EMDR and dissociation. And I think that's something that the psychological community is learning about. I remember when I did my EMDR training, which I believe was about 2011 as well, the trainer said, oh, if the person's dissociating, you're going to need to do it differently and refer out, essentially. But they didn't have any resources for where to refer. And I remember being in the training because I raised my hand and said, my mother happens to be a psychologist specializing in dissociation, and people like taking down her name and all of that. So it felt very grassroots within this like EMDR to dissociation bridge. And I feel like that bridge has developed over the past decade plus. I feel like you're a big part of that, in leading the EMDR training for the ISSTD, and just in swimming in the soup for so long and working with the clients and working with your own experiences. So I'm curious for you how that was to bring EMDR and dissociation together.
One of the people who first wrote about EMDR and dissociation was Sandra Paulson.
Mm-hmm.
She has described EMDR as a divining rod for dissociation. It will find it if it's there because it kickstarts a robust associative process in the brain.
Yes.
What we normally think of as learning.
Yeah. When
the learning's gotten disrupted for some reason, affective or somatic overwhelm.
Yeah.
I actually, in addition to that, I think of EMDR as a lightning rod.
Yeah.
For dissociation because it has a reputation for rapid resolution.
Yes.
And people are highly attracted to it. And so when I got trained in EMDR, I started encountering clients or I won't even say clients, people whom I don't think I would have come into contact with in a knowing kind of way otherwise. Because people were seeking resolution for whatever it was that had been dogging them for a long time. and EMDR seemed like the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
I just didn't know enough to help them at the time.
Yeah. I've heard people also refer to EMDR as a power tool, right? Like it really gets in there. And I think that, if you're using a power tool and you don't know where you're going or you don't know what the landscape is, that's ripe for, more information or mystery or even disruption to arise.
Well, with great power comes great responsibility, as they say.
Exactly. So before we dive deeper into this, I want to back up a little and just ask how you, in your own words right now, would describe or define dissociation to folks who are listening. We're talking about this the entire season. We've talked about it in other seasons as well, but it seems to be something that repetition really benefits, right? People really benefit from the repetition and the different angles and words that folks use.
I know that a lot of different answers have been offered to this question.
Yeah.
I'm a social worker, and I was trained to think in terms of systems.
Yeah.
So I think of dissociation as the opposite of association.
Yes.
Whether it's at the societal level, the community level, the family level, or the individual level.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're looking at it, the micro level ostensibly is, the individual. I think about a nano level of what's going on inside the self.
Yes.
And how, in the same way that we see with societal oppression or just a lack of communication or understanding, what happens? There's wounding that happens. There's separation, sometimes generations deep separation.
Yes.
I see the same thing happening for individuals and within them. If it's not safe to connect, we don't. It's what keeps us alive and sane.
Yeah.
So it's a broad answer to what's dissociation, but I'm not a neurobiologist. I do think of it more in terms of the different levels of systems.
Yeah.
And it seems to apply. If someone's wounded inside, it's going to affect all those other levels.
Yes.
And vice versa. If society is torn apart, it's going to deeply affect the individual. So being trained enough to identify that wounding and know of ways to help heal it at the individual level all the way up to the societal level seems like it's beneficial for all.
This piece is really important, especially right now when I feel like our country and lots of folks are learning about trauma, learning about collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, attempting to address it. And sometimes, as you said earlier, in a different way, swimming in the soup, right? Just swimming in it. And it's hard to find land. It's hard to find perspective sometimes within that. So even just holding this dissociation versus association, disconnection versus connection, I think that's a very helpful ground for folks to have and come back to.
It seems like it's really easy for dissociation to take on these really esoteric meanings.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that if I can really keep thinking of it in terms of it's a lack of association, it helps demystify it.
Mm-hmm. So then what's tricky about using EMDR, this lightning bolt, this power tool of association, when you're working with dissociation as it presents clinically or in an individual?
I could answer this as a practitioner. I could answer this as a consultant. I could answer this as a trainer of EMDR therapy. But speaking as all three, I would say that the trickiest thing is how it's taught and not taught about.
Yes.
I was not prepared. I didn't even know anything about PTSD really when I trained in EMDR.
Yeah. Wow.
Seemingly, then your basic training in EMDR becomes your education in, quote, trauma.
Yeah.
It's not at all adequate. It's like a page from the Cliff's Notes.
Yeah.
And if you are told by an authority that you know enough, or this is unknowable, so don't go there.
Right.
You're probably going to believe them.
Yeah.
I could get into the nitty gritty of what makes it tricky, but there are so many things that make it tricky.
Yeah.
But if we start from the individual level and we say, okay, I'm sitting with this person who maybe doesn't know themselves very well yet, or they're in this process of learning about themselves. And if we are saying that dissociation is all about not knowing, it's all about hiddenness, both from oneself and from the world, as one big thinker has said, then we're also not able to know their mind.
Right.
I mean, that's a given. We can't just climb inside that black box and know everything. If we don't know them and we don't know enough about the phenomena in general, like the different manifestations of dissociation, and we don't have adequate training in approaches to addressing that, we're at a huge disadvantage.
Yes.
With that in mind, there are then, I estimate, 3 camps in the EMDR therapy field. One says never use EMDR with a person with dissociation or dissociative disorder, which sounds like what you heard.
Right.
The idea being that EMDR itself is dangerous. Or it's the great unknown.
Yeah.
And
the message I got was, it's too complicated.
It's too complicated.
Too complicated, so just screen for it first. And then there was no map of what to do after that.
Well, this is where how it's taught and not taught is problematic.
Yeah.
If the teacher doesn't understand the nuance, they're not going to be able to convey it or translate it into human language to be able to say to someone, it's actually possible to do these things and you're going to need to specialize.
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect an orthopedic surgeon to know how to do brain surgery just because they know how to pick up a scalpel.
Right.
We're handing you a scalpel, but you need to learn how to use it in a particular way with particular issues.
100%.
So, any trauma-focused therapy can be dangerous in the hands of an uninformed or underinformed practitioner.
Yes.
So that's one camp. Another is those who say you should just break through the dissociation. But I'm like, really? You should just break through it? This is an argument that's made currently in the EMDR world. And I have to say, I'm not going to break into a house that doesn't belong to me. I'm not going to just walk in.
Yes.
And by the same token, I'm not going to indiscriminately break through dissociative barriers that probably exist for some really good reasons.
Yes.
That might be beyond my comprehension and perhaps even my client's awareness at the point where we are.
Yes. I gave an analogy earlier in the season of a power tool, using a power tool on a house, right? Like if you don't know the structure of the house or how the power tool is going to impact working on the door frame, the whole thing might collapse, or you might hit water or gas, or you kind of have to have a map.
Or electricity.
Right?
You might drill into something or break into something. And I always say to consultees, you cannot get that toothpaste back in the tube once you've squeezed it out.
Yeah. Yeah. So it can get really messy really fast.
And your client's going to be stuck with it.
Yep.
And that leads to the 4th camp that has magically appeared in my thinking, which is where my bias is. I was trying to think. I was like, I wrote this down. Like, what was the 3rd camp?
Is it folks who are trying to be skillful and learn how to use the scalpel and work with dissociation?
It's the protocols.
Oh.
Actually, I guess there are 4 camps. This is not a taxonomy. I just totally made this up, but it's an impression.
I love it.
I'll just own that. This is totally my bias. So I'd say the 4 camps. So the 3rd would be, it's all about the protocols.
Okay.
And I see this frequently on discussion groups. I'm not really on social media. Like I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. But I see this on the EMDR discussion groups. Well, does someone have a protocol for such and such?
Yeah.
And, it's a seizure. It's a pseudo seizures, or they have this kind of sensation in their body, but they don't say that it's medically explained or not medically explained. There's no context.
Right.
And so it's like, do you have an Allen wrench or do you have a Phillips screwdriver?
Right.
It's like, well, what are you trying to do?
Yeah.
And I don't have enough context to say that it's probably appropriate to hand you a Phillips screwdriver or an Allen wrench.
Yeah.
which is really annoying and inconvenient for somebody to say that. But I just ruin everybody's party. That's how I feel. Like, I'm not going to give you a Phillips screwdriver. I want you to explain to me the context for what you're doing, and then we can talk about possibilities. But no, we're not going to just go via protocols.
Right.
I distinctly remember in grad school. So I studied psychodynamic psychotherapy in grad school. That was my focus.
Mm-hmm.
And my professors were analysts.
Yeah.
And I very, very distinctly remember in one day in class in my second year saying, I don't understand why we can't just have tools. Just tell us what to do. Yeah. And my professor just had this bemused look on their face and shook their head very gently. And I didn't understand. And I get it now.
Yeah.
It's like, well, what's your framework? How are you conceptualizing what's going on for this person?
Yeah.
Before you decide what to do, I can't just give you a tool because I don't have any idea how you're going to use it. I want you to learn how to use the tool and when.
Yes.
Not just have it. And that leads to the fourth camp that has magically appeared in my thinking, which is where my bias is. If you really want to use EMDR therapy to treat dissociation and people with dissociative disorders, you need to really know the 100+ years of literature. And you need to take coursework. And you really need to specialize, because for those of us that have chosen to do that, it becomes kind of your life's work.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. You have to study. I think the first American journal that really dealt with dissociation on an ongoing basis was what was called the Journal of Abnormal Psychology.
Mm.
And that was Morton Prince was the founding editor. And it's really something to read those early articles. Mm. They're free on the internet. You can actually get hold of them. It blows my mind to see that there's not that much new under the sun.
Yeah.
We're often talking about the same things, but you don't know that unless you read.
Right.
Unless you study, you take coursework, learn from people that have been doing this for decades.
Yes.
And there are no shortcuts. You can't just apply a protocol. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Because people don't work that way.
Absolutely.
And it's worth the time to study and to be curious. I frequently consult with people, both around learning how to discern dissociative symptoms and conceptualize how to work with the people that have them. And it's really obvious when someone has taken EMDR-informed dissociation courses.
Yes.
That talk about how to deal with issues, but don't teach anything about how to understand the dissociation itself and all of the complicated phenomena contained therein.
Right.
It's not just fixing a drain. It's not just treating a symptom. You're dealing with a whole person.
Whole person and an entire system. And to your point earlier, this is
and a whole lot of history.
So much history, some which is known, some which is unknown, some which will be known, some which won't be known. It gets complex really quickly.
Yeah.
You've outlined some potential common mistakes folks make or camps they fall in that, as I'm hearing it, might not best serve their client.
Mm.
So I'm wondering, as you've trained so many EMDR clinicians, if there is a specific common mistake, but also if there's a aha moment that you see show up frequently for folks as they're starting to bridge this, okay, I have this lightning rod power tool and I have this really complex client or system that I'm working with. And as they're building that bridge to figure out how the two can work together, are there common places they slip up? Are there common places they go, oh, okay, this is the connection. This is how I can make it work or support it in working well?
It's actually changed some. It used to be that clinicians would knock on the door when they had screwed up.
Yeah.
And they're like, I don't know what to do now.
Right.
That seems to be shifting some for some, because more and more trainings in EMDR are catching on to how important it is. to discern dissociation ahead of time and like actually teach clinicians how to do it. The biggest mistake that I have seen is assuming that you know something when you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell people this is like a paradigm shift, and it's a painful one. And I know because I've been through it. That's maybe not as direct an answer, maybe a more philosophical answer, but there is a practicality to someone being humbled by recognizing they don't know as much as they think they do.
Absolutely. It's in service of figuring out what might work.
Yes. And I think about opening the door to this other world, and there's a wonder in that.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying, oh, this is so much more nuanced than I realized. And I had somebody that I was consulting with just yesterday. We were talking about a very specific instance with a client of theirs. The discussion was originally about EMDR, but we moved beyond that and deeper into it, and it became about something else entirely. And there was this look on their face. It was like this sense of awe and curiosity and interest. And they're saying, oh, this is amazing. This hadn't occurred to me. And that moment is where it's like, yes. And now, because your world is bigger, you're going to do better work.
Yes.
You're going to be able to attune more readily, more ably, which means you can see your client as a whole person rather than as just one facet of a whole diamond. That's earth-shattering for me.
It is. And for everyone going through that experience of healing or treatment or therapy, it opens up.
And it's that paradigm shift.
Yeah. And that's the most important thing, is once we see something different, we have to do something different. And that can be a really challenging transition for someone who's been through school and been through training and gotten credentials and is sitting there as the support person, perhaps even the expert, and something comes at you that fundamentally shifts. It's a basis that's completely different than the basis of all your training, right? And then you go, oh, yeah, this might be a little painful, but I've got to step through this portal into a place where I don't understand, and I need to learn. And I need to learn not just from reading and from books and from trainings, but also from the person that's in front of me or the people that are in front of me.
And it's not like we're coming from, as clinicians, not necessarily coming from some enlightened place.
Right.
We have all of what we brought with us. Connie Dallenberg highlighted that clinicians are apt not to believe what their clients tell them when it comes to trauma material.
Interesting.
Not because they want to ignore it, but because it's almost like it gets filtered out.
It doesn't fit or something.
Our own brains, it's like we cannot look at this. And if we can't look at it, it's much harder to invite our client to look at it.
That makes me think of just an enactment of client can't look at it, therapist can't look at it, society can't look at it, right? And then how do we begin to heal without that? That's the dissociation, right? And we're looking for some amount of hopefully slow paced, healthy reconnection that allows us to start to understand and look at these things.
Nobody wants to look.
Right. It's painful too. That's the whole point.
We have to kind of train to learn to be able to tolerate to look.
Right. And that's, my experience, a slow ongoing process, not a 10-step protocol, for example. Right.
Yeah. It's not an arrival. It's that you just keep journeying.
So I'm wondering what you feel is important for people at large to understand about EMDR, trauma, and dissociation. So you offer training to clinicians, but there's also this broader understanding, perhaps even within the clinical community or within, society in a broader sense. What do you wish people understood better about EMDR, trauma, and dissociation?
I pondered on this quite a bit, and I guess what I would say is as with all psychology, there's a lot of pop cultural understanding and sort of tip of the fingernail wisdom.
Yeah.
We're complex individuals in general, regardless of whether we have involved histories. And the more complex the underlying issues, the more complex the treatment. No matter which approach the therapist or approaches the therapist is trained in. EMDR is not a cure-all, but it's also not ineffectual. I recall you sending me a link to a podcast, Lisa.
Yes.
It was about the neuroscience of PTSD.
Yes.
By a person based at Stanford.
Yes.
During which the use of so-called, this is quotes, so-called EMDR was discussed.
Yeah.
And this person said that it involves moving the eyes side to side while recalling a traumatic memory. Well, speaking as a person who helped design an 81-hour training in the standard approach to using EMDR therapy with people who don't have really complicated stuff going on inside, it's far more than that.
Yeah.
It's far more involved. It's a very technical therapy. There's a lot of focus on the eye movements because it's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Sure.
In general, this person also focuses a lot on that. And I say this, I point this person out because it's kind of emblematic of the stereotypes.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of focus on the desensitization piece, but not so much on the reprocessing.
Right.
And I guess what I would say is it's far more complex than the media would. I say this on a medium at the moment. Have you believe?
Yeah.
There's a reason that people spend decades studying these things. It's because sometimes it takes decades to understand them fully.
Yes.
In all of their nuance. It's not because we want to be pulling wool over anyone's eyes and selling snake oil. It's because, again, we're complex beings and we need to understand all the nuance with what we're doing as practitioners. You know, I would never want to bore listeners with the details of things that are maybe only interesting to some. But what I would say is there's a lot here to explore. There's a misconception that EMDR is only appropriate for single event trauma and that it can't be used for longer term change. That's not true.
You just need a lot more training, right?
You need a lot more training.
Yeah.
Yes.
You need a lot more training. When it gets more complex, it gets more complicated.
It's very effective for single episode.
Right.
I am never going to stop learning new things about EMDR, but I actually was on a different podcast recently. It was the EMDR International Association, and there was a question, what would you be if you were not an EMDR therapist? And I said, well, I'd still be a therapist.
Yeah.
I also said, or I'd run an antique store. But I don't necessarily think of myself as an EMDR therapist. I don't only use EMDR therapy. And with my more complex clients, I'm very, very strategic about using it, and I use other things too.
Yeah.
I think if all the focus is on EMDR can do this and it can't do that, it ignores the reality that we shouldn't be one-trick ponies as practitioners.
And that the listening aspect of being a therapist is so essential to take in information, not just words that you're hearing, but to take in all the information you're presented with and to let that digest with everything you've read and everything you've trained in and all of your experience and who you are that day. And to say, based on what this person is presenting, this feels like the best place to start. This feels like where you will get the most benefit, right? And even for a quote unquote single event trauma, to simply say, okay, nice to meet you. Heard you were in a car accident. Let's do some EMDR. And that's not how EMDR training, the first step is assessment, right? For everyone. So I don't think there are people out there doing that. But I think, like you said, the popular conception can make it seem like, well, I don't have to have any other knowledge other than the fact that I'm still having symptoms that feel related to this car accident. I can just jump in.
Well, and some of that goes back to what's been taught. I mean, to be fair, that didn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It has been argued by some who are more foundational thinkers in the EMDR therapy field that a solid relationship with your client isn't necessary for healing to happen. But I also think that's a very context-specific statement, and it's not generalizable to all.
Yeah.
Especially if you're talking about someone who has a history of attachment injury.
Oh, 100%. And I'm just noticing time. I know we need to wrap up. I sound like such a therapist.
You sound like such a therapist. I'm not done yet.
I want to talk more about attachment. I want to talk more about all these things, but there's a really important question I want to make sure I can ask you, which is, what does it look like when EMDR goes well with someone who's experienced complex trauma or dissociation? Are there any sort of key factors that you see that highlight a pathway of healing where a therapist might know, okay, we're going in a positive direction, or a client might feel like maybe this is a lot, but this is good? Are there touch points, flags along the way that you would highlight?
Yeah, you're going to see either state change and or trait change. And that's what they talk about in EMDR therapy training. So with state change, you might see symptom reduction.
Yeah.
That results in a state change indicated by a person just feeling better, which is what we hope for in general. But there's also something deeper, which is you might see trait change. And there it's evidenced by a more fundamental shift in how someone experiences themselves in relation to the world and others around them, and how they move through the world. Yeah. And there are huge ripple effects with that. I mean, we could put an ellipsis there, ... It invites all kinds of curiosity about what would happen if people didn't only feel better, but also felt differently about themselves in relation to the world. I can give a specific example where working with a client who met criteria for DID, who had avoided doctors and dentists for years because they had both profound medical trauma as well as dental trauma from childhood and adolescence.
Yeah.
And I liken using EMDR with someone with DID to riding a unicycle uphill while juggling, and you're wearing a blindfold.
Oh.
So trying to know as much as you can about your terrain is really important. Yes. And I knew a fair amount about the terrain for this individual. And after 3 or 4 sessions of reprocessing, maybe 5 total across those 2 separate issues, it wasn't a problem anymore.
Wow.
And the client has since reflected on this. I still work with them. And they said, that totally changed my life. Yeah. They've been able to start going to the doctor and taking care of themselves differently. They were able to have a dental surgery that was quite complex without any kind of phobic response.
Wow.
Like, they were able to get a surgery that they have needed for years, and it was just amazing. And I felt so honored to get to be a part of that and to help facilitate that change, because it was this huge roadblock for this person taking care of themselves, and it had huge ripple effects in their life.
Mm-hmm. Very powerful, right? And that's when you use the scalpel well. Is there anywhere you would point people who are either looking for training or looking for support that's, dissociation informed EMDR?
There are a lot of places to go. I would say go to the dissociation stuff first. I'll, as you mentioned, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. I would go there.
Yeah.
There is education there about EMDR and dissociation. The training that we do is a basic training, so it won't be an advanced training. There are lots of places to get advanced training. And I think if you really don't understand the dissociation, or you only understand a smidgen of it, it's not going to matter how many protocols you know.
Mm-hmm.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think that gives folks who are looking for their own treatment something to ask, right? Their providers. They can ask about training in dissociation. They can ask about EMDR training. They can ask about, even these 4 camps that you've created today. They can assess for which camp folks are in, just for their own information.
This is where, this movement to be a more, people wanting more information about their treatment.
Yeah.
I think comes into play because you could just go to any EMDR trained therapist, but it's complicated. And the reality is a lot of people who come into therapy don't realize that they're only dealing with a tip of the iceberg issue. Yes. And so they're not walking in saying, I need someone who's trained in working with people with dissociative disorders.
Yes.
They're saying, I want to work with someone who knows how to treat such and such an issue. And then the therapist does hopefully their due diligence and says, I think there might be more going on than meets the eye.
Yes.
And then it's actually incumbent upon the therapist to say, I need more training, or I need to refer you out, or I need to go get consultation. So it's a both and. If you already know that you're dealing with the dissociation or complex trauma, you have a complex history with a lot of different difficulties that you faced, asking the therapist explicitly, so how have you learned how to work with these kinds of issues?
Mm-hmm.
Where have you done training? Whom are you studying with?
Yes.
And then do your homework. Go look these people up.
Yeah. I know you have a client or consultee to get to. We've taken you right to the hour. Thank you so much for your time. How can people connect with you?
You can find me through my website. It's dmcoy.com. You can also send me an email at dmcoy@dmcoy.com.
Nice.
I'm on LinkedIn.
You're on LinkedIn. Okay, great. We'll link all that in the show notes, and we so appreciate your time, Michael. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you for your time as well.
Thanks so much for listening. My hope is that you walk away from these episodes feeling supported and like you have a place to come to find the hope and inspiration you need to take your next small step forward. For more information and resources, please visit my website, howwecanheal.com. There, you'll find tons of helpful resources and the full transcript of each show. You can also click the podcast menu to submit requests for upcoming topics and guests. I look forward to hearing your ideas.